Here I have bids open, ready to create a new project. I'm going to add a data flow to the package, execute a SQL query to provide data, and then export the results to a text file. So we're going to start exercising some of the features of bids that you can use in order to create packages. I'll start by doing File, New, Project. And this opens up the New Project dialog box. Because I have SQL Server and Integration Services installed, I have this Business Intelligence Projects folder. And this has various project templates that you can use to build analysis services, integration services, and reporting services projects. But obviously here I'm interested in integration services, and so I'm going to put that in my demos directory, and I'm going to call this project the AdventureWorks Export. I'm going to create a directory for the solution, and I can use the Browse button, but I already have it in the correct location. If you've used Visual Studio, this dialog box is going to be very familiar to you because it's being provided by Visual Studio. And I'll click on OK, and Bids goes through and creates that project. So I'll hide the Properties window there, and if I look at Solution Explorer, you can see that I have this new project with my set of folders and a default package. And the default name is always package or package 1, package 2, package 3, depending on how many packages I have. And I can rename that by right-clicking on it and selecting Rename. And I'm going to call this Export. And hit Enter. And you can see that I get this dialog box that asks, do you want to rename the package object as well? Internal to the package is an object that is by default named the same as the file name, in this case package, when it first creates the package. So generally I want to go ahead and change that so that I have a consistent name throughout the project. All right, and you can see that I have the export package. By the way, when you're renaming it, make sure that you don't eliminate the .dtsx extension. Bids will warn you if you do that, but if you ignore the warning, the file is going to probably become unusable from within Bids. Also, sometimes when you try to rename a package right after you create it, you'll get an error message that says that you can't rename it because some sort of process has control over the package. That just means that Integration Services and Bids is still setting up the package, and you need to wait until it's done. But probably what's quicker is to just close the package from the designer and reopen it, and then you can rename it. All right, so the next thing I'm going to do is create a data source. So I right-click on the Data Sources folder and click on New Data Source. And this gives me the Data Source wizard. I'll click on Next to move past the Welcome screen. And then I have to define the connection. I don't currently have any data connections defined, so I'll click on the New button. And that gives me the Connection Manager dialog box. I'm going to connect to SQL Server. I'm going to enter local as the server name. But you can also put in the machine name, you can put in localhost, you can put in period if it's going to access the SQL Server 2008 instance on the local machine. I'm going to use Windows Authentication, so I'll leave that radio button selected. And then I'm going to read data from the AdventureWorks database, so I'll select that there. Then I'll click on the Test button here to make sure that all my settings are correct, and they are. And now we have a new connection to the AdventureWorks database. So I'll select it there, it's already selected, and click on the Next button. This next page of the wizard lets me define the name of the data source as it'll appear within Solution Explorer, and I'll just accept the default. And there we go. We now have an AdventureWorks data source that I can share amongst various packages within the solution. All right, it's now time to start designing the package. I'm on the Control Flow Designer, and I'm going to go over to the toolbox here and drag over a data flow task. The designer gives the task the default name of data flow task, but I almost always want to change that. So I'm going to right-click on it and select Rename. And I'm going to call it Export Contacts. There's various kinds of naming conventions that you can use, such as including the name of the task in there. But I find that just giving it a meaningful name, I can use the icon that appears to identify what the particular task is. And if I forget, I can always hover the mouse and it shows data flow task within the tooltip. Now I need to edit that data flow. Typically, when you double-click on a control flow task, it opens up some sort of custom editor, some sort of dialog box. But because the data flow is so complex, when I double-click on it, it actually goes to an entirely separate designer that is dedicated to creating data flows. First thing I need to do is add a connection manager. So I'm going to right-click here, down in the Connection Managers pane, and notice that I have several options for the type of connection that I want to create. I already have a data source defined, so I'll select that option. I only have one defined, so that's automatically selected in the list, and I can view the connection string if I want to make absolute sure that's the one that I want, and click on OK. And so now I have a connection manager that is based on that data source for this particular package. Now I need to define the source of the data within the data flow. And for that, I'm going to use an OLEDB source. So I'll grab that from the toolbox. And notice that when I add that source, it has this red icon. And I can hover over that and get a tooltip that indicates that a connection manager has not been assigned to the runtime connection OLEDB connection. I haven't configured it yet, so it's not able to execute. So I'll double-click on this in order to open up the OLEDB source editor. And here's where I define where my data for this data flow is going to come from. Here's the list of connection managers. I only have one defined within this package, so that's what appears and selected within the list. And then I can access the data in that table either from a tabular view, by a table name or a view name variable, by a SQL command, or a SQL command from variable. These two variable options are based on using a variable that I would have previously defined within the package in order to get access to the information. But in this case, I want to use a SQL command in order to get a subset of the fields that are available within a particular table. So I select SQL command, and I get this nice text box. I have some options for building a query and to browse to the data and so forth. But in this case, I'm just going to type in a select statement. Select contact ID, title, first name, last name, email address, phone, from the person.contact table. So, fairly simple select statement, but the nice thing here is that rather than reading all of the columns from the table, I extract just the ones that I want, just the ones that I'm going to use within this package. That's a best practice because I want to minimize the amount of traffic, the amount of data traffic that is passing between that SQL Server table, which very easily could be on a remote server, into my package. But I can also include a where clause. If I don't want to include all of the data, I can include where clauses as well and join on other data and so forth. So I have the complete power of a transact SQL select statement. If I want to, I can click the preview button to preview the data that's going to be extracted. So I can make sure that all of my columns look right. I am in fact getting the kind of data that I expect, and it displays up to roughly the first 200 rows, if there are that many rows within the table. All right, so I'll click OK to close that. And now notice that the red icon, the red X icon, is gone because I've now configured that. There still could be runtime problems. I may not have permissions to read the data, for example. And that won't appear as a red icon here, but will show up as a runtime error. But at this point, BIDS and Integration Services considers that component to be configured. Next thing I need to do is define where the data is going to go to. So for that, I'm going to grab a flat file destination. By the way, don't be confused between the destinations and the sources. The source objects here are going to read data from the source and insert it into the data flow. The destinations are going to take the data flow and output to a file. So I'll select the flat file. And once again, I get the red X icon because it's not yet configured. Now I need to connect these two components. So I'll select the OLEDB source. Notice that I have two arrows. I'm going to take the green arrow, which is the success execution, and drag it down onto this flat file destination. So that defines the data path, assuming that the data can be read from that OLEDB source that I defined. All right, so now we need to configure this, so I'll double-click on it, and that opens up the flat file destination editor. I don't yet have any flat file connection managers defined, so I'll use the New button to define one. First thing it asks is the format of the destination flat file. I'm going to use the delimited option so that it's a comma-separated values type file. But you could also define a fixed width with row delimiters, and a ragged right format. Just different formats of text files with data. And that opens up the Flat File Connection Manager editor. I'm going to name it Contacts for Export. And then use the Browse button in order to export this to my demos directory. And I'll name the file contacts.txt. Notice that a lot of the options that I'm going to use here are similar to the options that the import and export wizard provided. That's because ultimately it's creating these same kinds of components, but now we're using the BIDS interfaces in order to create those tasks. I want to include the column names in the first data row, so I'll select that option. All right, I'll click on OK, and now we have a flat file connection manager. Notice that the OK button is disabled. That's because we haven't yet set the mappings for how the source data, the data flow data, is going to be exported to this file. So to do that, click on the Mappings page here. And here is where I can see that by default, the destination fields are going to be the same names as the source fields. That's not required. I can change the fields if I want to by changing the mappings down here. I'm just going to leave the defaults, and so I'll click on OK, and now our flat file destination is configured. The package is now ready for executing, but let's stop first and talk a little bit about executing a package in BIDS. Once you've added a control flow to a package, you've created what Integration Services calls an executable. Executing, or running the package, is how you invoke the Integration Services runtime engine. So once you've built and deployed the package, you'll probably use the SQL Server Execute Package utility, which is the dtexec.exe file, in order to execute the package. But during development, you'll probably want to run your package using BIDS because it has various debugging tools that you can use in order to help you with troubleshoot problems. Now, if you've worked with Visual Studio before, the process for executing a package is going to be very similar to entering debugging mode in other development projects, such as a Visual Basic or C# web application. And in many ways, it really is the same. You enter debugging mode and can watch the various tasks or the steps execute. You can even step through breakpoints once you learn how to add them to a package. But unlike working in ASP.NET or with Windows development executables, there's no build process as such, no visible compile process. Integration Services uses the package file you created as its instruction set. That's that DTSX file. That's the executable. There's no need to create a binary before running it. So there's several ways to execute the package within BIDS. From the toolbar, there's a Start Debugging icon. From the Debug menu, you can select Start Debugging, or you can press F5, assuming that you haven't changed the default keystroke mappings within BIDS or Visual Studio. And at that point, the package will execute, and you'll be able to see its progress graphically. Control flow and data flow tasks turn yellow when they execute, as they're executing, and that might be a long process. A single task could literally take hours to execute, and it'll stay yellow that whole time. And then it turns green once that step is complete, or it'll turn red if an error occurs. You'll also get a new designer pane called the Progress pane, and that displays a hierarchical list of the tasks as the package executes. Also, keep in mind that you have to stop the debugging process. Even once the package finishes executing, it's still in debugging mode so that you can explore variables and check the state of various objects. Before you then start making changes to the package, you need to stop that debugging mode, and I'll show you how to do that. Now, let's go back to the package that we just created and see how we can execute it. I'll go ahead and execute the package by clicking the Start Debugging icon here on the toolbar. Now watch the package carefully, because you're going to see the white elements turn yellow and then turn green. And it happens fairly quickly because this is a relatively small number of rows. As with most things in life, green is good. As you can see, both tasks executed successfully. You can take a look at the Progress pane, and you can see all of the steps that BIDS and integration services performed in order to execute this package. If anything had gone wrong, there would be some basic error information about the problem. But notice that there's a lot of steps for executing a package, and there are a lot of validation steps that integration services does to make sure that it can connect to the various resources and perform the steps that you specify. I'll go back over to the data flow here. Notice the state that BIDS is now in. Strictly speaking, we are still executing and debugging this package. The tasks are still green, and we have this link here. Package execution completed. Click here to switch to design mode, or select Stop Debugging from the Debug menu. So there's really three ways to stop execution once the package completes. I can click on this link as it says. I can go to the Debug menu and select Stop Debugging, or I can directly press Shift F5. So I'll click on that, and now we're back in design mode. Notice that the name of this tab has changed to Execution Results, so I can still see all of the steps and refer to those as I'm continuing to develop the package. Now I'll go over to Windows Explorer. And as you can see, we now have a contacts file, which I'll double-click in Notepad to open, and you can see all of the data that was exported. So what we've done at this point is essentially created a package that did the same thing that we earlier did using the import and export wizard. It's a little bit more work to do it this way, creating everything from scratch within BIDS, but it also gives you way more flexibility. And throughout this course, we're going to explore a lot of how you can create some very complex packages that handle your specific scenarios. Being able to execute a package from within BIDS is critical to help you develop the package and make it robust. But that's where BIDS' job is finished. So once you've finished deployment, then you need to deploy a package and execute it outside of BIDS. So the scenario is that you develop the package, probably on your local development machine, and then once you're ready to put it into production, deploy it to the production server, or more likely a test or staging server first, but ultimately to a production server. And then you need to execute the package there. It's highly unlikely that you'll want to install either Visual Studio or BIDS on that server, so there are other ways to execute that package. So during the ongoing life cycle of the package, you can, for example, execute it from SQL Server's Management Studio. This lets administrators connect to the Integration Services Windows service and import, export, and execute packages using the same tool that they probably use all day long to do other administrative tasks within SQL Server. You can also create a SQL Server agent job that allows you to schedule a package to execute either one time in the near future or on a regular basis. When you create robust packages that are able to, say, download files from an FTP server, clear out different staging tables and then archive the files, that becomes a very handy way to automate the process of importing data into a database or data warehouse. You can also execute the package using the SQL Server Execute Package utility. This is a command line tool for executing packages. So you can use it from PowerShell or from the command prompt or however you want to execute that package. There's also a companion utility called the Graphical Execute Package utility, which is a nice GUI interface in order to develop the command line for the Execute Package utility. And you can also execute the package directly from that graphical interface. Now let's take a look at using that graphical interface to execute our package. I'll select Start, Programs, SQL Server 2008, Integration Services, and the Execute Package utility. Now this is a handy way to start it from the Start menu, but I just as easily could have used the Run menu or run it from a command prompt, in which case I would execute the dtexecui.exe file. So here's this nice graphical interface. In this case, I just created the package in bids, so I need to use the file system because it's located out as a dist file. And then I can use this button here in order to open up the Open dialog and go to my Demos directory and my Project directory and load that export file. Next, I need to configure the connection managers used. What the utility does is it looks inside the package and sees the connection managers that the package has defined. I need to use both of those, so I'm going to enable both of them. And that's all I need to do to configure execution. I'll go ahead and click on Execute. And as you can see, I get this nice progress dialog box that shows me all of the steps, and I can scroll down here and everything executed successfully. So I can once again go to my Demos directory, see the contacts file, open it up, and take a look at the contacts. And the results should obviously be the same as executing it within bids. By the way, you shouldn't need to delete the contacts.txt file between executions, no matter how you execute the package or with what tool. Integration Services should overwrite the file, but you may get an error message in some Windows configurations that the file already exists. In that case, stop execution and delete the contacts file, and then try it again.